All right, today we're going to dive into this really fascinating idea, something that connects our deepest, darkest cultural fears to these huge, invisible forces that are kind of shaping our world every single day. So welcome to our explainer on what's called the Monstrous Global. And we're kicking things off with a question that, I know it sounds like the setup to a really weird joke. What in the world do zombies have to do with the 2008 financial crisis? Yeah, you heard that right. But stick with me here, because the answer, wow, it reveals something truly profound about how we all try to make sense of our modern world. See, that question isn't just about zombies and banks. It's actually a doorway, a way into a much, much bigger idea. It gets right to the heart of a really fundamental human behavior. Why do we even invent monsters in the first place? Okay, so here it is. This is the main idea of this whole explainer, and it comes from the work of Ju-Young Jin and Jay Rowe. They argue that monsters, well, they aren't just for scaring kids at Halloween, right? No, they're actually a cultural tool, a tool we use to give a concrete form, a face, to these massive abstract anxieties that we all feel, things like economic instability or climate change. Monsters are how we make the invisible visible. So let's put a proper name to this whole idea, because of course, academics have a specific term that just perfectly captures this phenomenon. And that term is the monstrous global. So what does that mean? Well, it's basically what happens when a system, let's take globalization for example, becomes so huge, so incredibly complex, that we just can't create a mental map of it. We can't really picture how it all works or how it's affecting our daily lives. And when our brains can't map it, our culture, it tends to, well, monster it. And here it is, straight from the source itself. Jen and Rowe argue that it's precisely this inability to mentally process these enormous forces that leads to what they call monstrous representations. Think about it. You and I can't just sit down and draw a coherent diagram of global capital flows, right? But a vampire? Yeah, we can definitely imagine a vampire. So, why globalization? Why does that feel so monstrous to us? Well, just think about it for a second. It doesn't have a single address, right? It's not a person you can point to. It's a process. It can create very, very real problems right in your own town, like a factory shutting down. But the actual cause is somewhere else. It's all spread out and far away. So you're left with this potent mix of anxiety and anger, but you've got no clear target to aim it at. And that feeling? That is the perfect breeding ground for a monster. And that's really the key right there. When a system is just too big, too abstract, too placeless to actually see or fight back against, what do? We invent something that has a face, something that has teeth, something that we can, at the very least, recognize. Okay, so let's see this whole theory in action. We're going to start with two of our most famous monsters, and their surprisingly direct connection to the economy. So, a scholar named David McNally, he points out something fascinating. Our most famous monsters are not random at all. Nope. They are deeply, deeply connected to the history of capitalism itself. As our economic system changes and evolves, so do our monsters. And this lays out that evolution just perfectly. So on one side, you've got the classic vampire. And Karl Marx famously used the vampire as a metaphor for early capitalism, right? A creature that literally sucks the life and labor out of the working class. But then, on the other side, you see how the monster has evolved. Now we have the zombie. The zombie represents a later stage of capitalism, a mindless, self-destructive, runaway system that isn't even really productive anymore. It's just endlessly consuming, all based on reckless speculation. And hey, this isn't just some abstract academic theory. This brings us right back to that question we started with. Remember zombie banks? That term blew up in our vocabulary during the 2008 financial crisis. It was the absolute perfect way to describe these giant financial institutions that were, for all intents and purposes, dead. But they were kept shambling along by government life support, not really doing anything positive. The monster literally became the metaphor. But it's not just about finance. This way of thinking, this whole monster thing, it also shapes our politics and our societies in a huge way, especially when it comes to our desire for security. I mean, think about basically any zombie story ever, like The Walking Dead. What is the absolute first thing the survivors do? They look for walls. They find a prison surrounded by fences. And the leader, Rick Grimes, he looks at it and says, it's perfect. That impulse, that need to wall ourselves off from the monsters, man, it is powerful.
That one scene perfectly illustrates a cycle that political theorist Wendy Brown calls walled psychology. Let's just walk through it real quick. Number 1, anxiety. It all starts with that nagging fear of these uncontrollable global forces. 2, demand. That fear creates a public demand for walls. for some feeling of security. 3. Reinforcement. But those walls start to create a defensive us versus them mindset, which leads us to the final and kind of ironic step: entrapment. The very walls we build to keep the monsters out end up trapping us inside with our own fear.
So here's the crucial point. That prison that looks so perfect when you're facing a zombie horde, it's still a prison. The solution we come up with to contain the monster can actually become a trap itself, isolating us and just reinforcing the very fear that made us build it in the first place.
All right, so as we start to wrap this up, there's a really fascinating twist to all this. It turns out that this idea of the monstrous isn't just about fear. Like any powerful symbol, it's got two sides. So on one side, yeah, you've got the fear. The monstrous can represent those terrifying global forces that create division. But on the other side, scholars point out something pretty incredible. These same monstrous spaces can become a kind of refuge for people who feel like outsiders. It allows them to find each other, to form new identities, and to build real solidarity.
And that brings us to our final big takeaway. Monsters aren't just a symptom of what scares us. They're a dynamic, living language. They are the way our culture tries to grapple with things it can't otherwise name. It's how we make those invisible forces that shape our lives tangible enough to actually tell stories about.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. The monsters we see in our movies, our books, and yeah, even in our headlines, they aren't just entertainment. They're basically messages from our collective subconscious. So the real question for all of us is, what monsters are we creating right now, and what are they trying to tell us about the world we're living in today?